The 18th floor conference room went silent when Eleanor Whitmore announced she was terminating Ryan Carter's contract in front of the entire executive board. The tall man stood still in the glass room, his shirt still damp with rain. 1 hour earlier, he had called to say he would arrive late because his mother had been rushed to the hospital. Eleanor gave him no second chance to explain. Ryan quietly packed his things and left under everyone's pity. She had no idea that days later, on her most desperate night, only that man would turn his car around to save her. Rain had been falling over the city for 3 days when Ryan Carter first felt that something was about to break. He had worked for Whitmore Logistics for nearly 12 years, long enough to know the building by its sounds, the hum of the freight elevators at dawn, the low buzz of the dispatch floor, the way the 18th floor went quiet whenever the executives gathered. He was the operations manager, the man who solved problems no one else wanted to touch, and in 12 years, he had never once raised his voice in that building. People respected him for that. The dock workers trusted him because he remembered their names and their overtime hours. The dispatchers came to him when a shipment went missing because he never blamed first and asked questions later. He was a man in his early 40s, a widower who lived alone and spoke little about himself, and most of his colleagues knew only that he was steady fare and impossible to rattle. What they did not know was how much of his strength was already spent each morning before he ever reached the office. His mother lived with him in a small house on the edge of the city, and her heart was failing. The doctors had been clear about that for almost a year. Every night, Ryan checked her medication, counted her pills, and listened to her breathing through the thin wall between their rooms. He paid for a nurse to come during the day while he worked, but the money stretched thin, and the worry stretched thinner. He carried all of it quietly, the way he carried everything, folded down small enough that no one at Whitmore Logistics ever saw the weight of it. The company itself had changed since the old man died. For decades, it had belonged to Charles Whitmore, a founder who knew his drivers by their first names and walked the warehouse floor in person. After his death, the entire empire passed to his daughter Eleanor, who was barely 30 and had inherited not only the company, but the constant suspicion that she was too young to hold it. She was sharp, decisive, and exhausting to work for, because she ran the company as if she had something to prove with every single decision. Eleanor Whitmore had spent her first months as chief executive trying to look harder than she felt. She arrived before sunrise and left after midnight. She memorized numbers the way other people memorized faces, and she had begun to believe that mercy was a luxury the company could not afford, while the board watched her every move. She did not yet understand that fear was a poor foundation for loyalty, and that the people who feared her were not the people who would save her. Standing closest to her, always with a calm smile and a folder of carefully chosen facts, was Gavin Pierce. He was a senior executive who had outlasted 3 reorganizations, and he had learned that the surest path to power was to make himself indispensable to whoever sat in the highest chair. With Charles gone, Gavin saw an opening he had waited years for. Eleanor was capable, but unsure, and an unsure leader could be guided, shaped, and slowly steered toward decisions that served his interests instead of hers. What no one knew was that Gavin had already begun moving operating contracts toward a shell company in which he quietly held shares. Each transfer was small enough to escape notice, hidden inside the kind of internal report that only the operations team ever read closely. And the operations team answered to Ryan Carter, which made Ryan the one man in the building who might eventually notice the pattern. Gavin understood that long before Ryan did. To protect what he was building, he needed Ryan gone, and he needed it to look like Ryan's own fault. The morning everything collapsed began like any other with a phone call at 6. Ryan was already awake, already dressed, when he heard his mother cry out from the next room. He found her gray-faced and gasping, one hand pressed flat against her chest, and the next 20 minutes blurred into sirens and hospital lights. He rode in the ambulance holding her hand, and as the doctors took her behind the swinging doors, he stepped into the hallway and made the only call he could think to make. He reached the Human Resources office and explained that his mother had been admitted to the emergency room, that he would be several hours late, and that he would come in the moment the doctors told him she was stable. The voice on the line told him not to worry, that they would note it, that family came first. Ryan thanked her, hung up, and went back to the waiting room to sit beneath the fluorescent lights and wait for someone to tell him whether his mother would live. He did not know that Gavin Pierce had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. By the time the executive board gathered for its morning meeting with several senior leaders and 2 major investors seated around the long glass table, Gavin had already reshaped the story. He stood and spoke about reliability, about accountability, about the dangers of letting standards slip during a fragile transition of leadership. Then he mentioned almost regretfully that the operations manager had simply failed to appear that morning, leaving a critical shipment unattended. Ryan's phone call was on record. But Gavin never mentioned it, and the way he framed the absence made it sound like a pattern rather than a single morning. He spoke of an irregularity in a recent shipment, a discrepancy he had personally flagged, and let the room draw the connection on its own. He did not accuse Ryan of anything directly. He simply arranged the facts so that a missing manager and a missing shipment seemed like the same problem, and then he turned the matter over to Eleanor, with the patience of a man who already knew what she would do. Eleanor felt every eye in the room turn toward her. The investors were watching to see whether the young chief executive could enforce discipline. The board was watching to see whether Charles Whitmore's daughter had inherited his spine. She felt the pressure close around her throat, and in that moment, she made the decision that would define everything that followed. She chose to look strong instead of asking to know more. When Ryan finally arrived that afternoon, his mother stabilized, and his shirt still damp from the parking lot to the lobby, he was called directly to the 18th floor conference room. He walked in expecting a reprimand. He did not expect to find the full board still seated, or Eleanor standing at the head of the table with a folder closed in front of her and her face arranged into something cold and final. She told him in front of all of them that his contract was being terminated, effective immediately. She cited unreliability. She cited a failure to uphold the responsibilities of his position at a moment the company could not afford it. Her voice did not shake, and that steadiness cost her more than anyone in the room understood, because some part of her already sensed she was making a mistake and refused to let herself feel it. Ryan looked at her for a long moment. He thought about explaining about the ambulance, the phone call, the gray of his mother's face. He could see even then that the decision had been made before he walked in, and that whatever he said would only become another thing they watched him fail at. So he said nothing at all. He simply nodded once, as if accepting something he had half expected from this version of the company. He gathered the few personal things from his desk into a single cardboard box, a photograph, a worn coffee mug, a small stack of notes, while the dispatch floor pretended not to watch. The dock workers who had trusted him for years stood frozen at their stations, and not one of them could meet his eyes because there was nothing any of them could do. He carried the box to the elevator, rode it down 18 floors in silence, and walked out into the gray afternoon without looking back. The story spread through Whitmore Logistics by the end of the day, and it spread wrong exactly as Gavin had intended. By the time it reached the lower floors, Ryan Carter had become the man who abandoned his post and got what he deserved. Only a few of the oldest employees doubted it because they knew Ryan, and what they knew did not fit the story. But they kept their doubts quiet because the woman who signed their paychecks had made her position clear in front of the entire board. For the next several days, Eleanor told herself she had done the necessary thing. She buried herself in numbers and meetings and the endless performance of authority, and she did not let her mind return to the image of a man nodding once and walking out without a word of defense. A guilty person argues, she told herself. A guilty person makes excuses. The fact that Ryan had done neither was a detail she pushed to the bottom of a very deep stack. But the work itself began to grind. 3 operational problems landed on her desk within a week, each one the kind of thing the missing operations manager had always handled before it became a crisis. Shipments stalled. A vendor relationship soured over a misunderstanding no one knew how to repair. Eleanor found herself realizing with a slow and unwelcome clarity how much invisible labor one quiet man had been doing, and how little of it had ever appeared in the reports she trusted. It was on a night near the end of that week that everything turned. Eleanor had driven herself to a late meeting with a distribution partner an hour outside the city, refusing the company driver because she still felt she had to prove she needed no one. The meeting ran long. By the time she pulled back onto the empty outer highway, the rain had returned heavier than before, hammering the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. Then the engine coughed, sputtered, and died. The car rolled to a slow stop on the shoulder of a dark stretch of road where the streetlights had given out long ago. She turned the key again and again, but the dashboard only flickered and went dark. Her phone showed a single bar of battery and no service worth the name, and the few cars that passed threw up walls of water and did not slow down. She sat there in the cold and the dark, watching her breath fog the glass, and for the first time in months, the armor she had built around herself simply fell away. She was not used to being helpless. The chief executive of a company with thousands of employees sat stranded on a roadside in a dead car, and none of her authority meant anything here. Her phone died as she was trying one last call. The rain grew louder. She felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time, which was the plain human fear of being alone. Somewhere, no one would come. Headlights appeared in her mirror slower than the others. An old pickup truck eased off the highway behind her and rolled to a stop, its engine rough and its paint dulled by years of use. A door opened. A tall figure stepped out into the downpour, raised an umbrella against the rain, and walked toward her window with an unhurried, careful gait that she recognized before she could see his face. When the man bent down and the light caught him, Eleanor felt the breath go out of her. It was Ryan Carter. The man she had humiliated in front of the entire board a week earlier was standing in the rain beside her car, the last person on earth she had any right to expect help from, and the only one who had stopped. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She braced herself for the bitterness she felt she deserved a sharp word, a cold smile, the satisfaction of watching her need him after what she had done. But none of it came. Ryan simply asked if she was hurt, and when she shook her head, he angled the umbrella to cover her and crouched to look at the front of the car. He did not mention the meeting on the 18th floor. He did not mention the box he had carried to the elevator, or the story now circling the company with his name on it. He checked the engine, confirmed what she already suspected, and told her plainly that the car would not start tonight, and that she should not sit out here waiting for a tow in this weather. Then he opened the passenger door of his truck and held the umbrella so she would stay dry crossing to it. Eleanor sat in the warm cab of the old pickup, soaked to the shoulders, while Ryan pulled back onto the highway and drove her toward the city through the rain. He kept his eyes on the road and his hand steady on the wheel. He offered her the cup of coffee from his thermos without a word, and she took it because she did not trust her own voice yet. The wipers beat steadily. The heater hummed. And somewhere in that silence, the careful story she had told herself all week began to come apart. She studied his profile in the dashboard, glow the calm of a man who had every reason to leave her on that road, and had chosen not to. And the shame she had been holding off for a week finally reached her. This was the man she had called unreliable. This was the man she had fired for failing to show up while he was sitting in a hospital hallway, waiting on his mother's heart. And here he was, showing up for her, asking nothing in return. Ryan dropped her at the edge of the city where she could reach a car service, made sure she was safe and dry before he left, and drove off into the rain without ever once raising what she had done to him. Eleanor stood under the awning and watched the tail lights of the old truck disappear, and for the first time since she had taken her father's chair, she understood that being strong and being right were not the same thing, and that she had badly confused the two. Eleanor did not sleep that night. She sat in her apartment with the lights off and the rain still falling against the windows, and she replayed every minute on that roadside until the shame of it settled into something harder and more useful. She had built her authority on the belief that she could read people, that she could look at a person and a report and know the truth. Ryan Carter had stopped his truck in the rain for the woman who fired him, and that single fact did not fit anything she believed about herself. She went into the office the next morning earlier than usual and did something she had never done before, which was to listen. She walked the dispatch floor instead of crossing it. She asked the dock supervisors about the missing shipment that had supposedly justified the firing, and she watched their faces carefully when she said Ryan's name. What she saw was not the contempt the official story had promised. It was something closer to grief, the quiet, careful kind that working people wear when they have lost someone they trusted and cannot say so out loud. One of them, an older logistics coordinator named Walter Briggs, who had been with the company since her father's time, finally spoke to her in the corner of the loading bay, where the cameras did not reach. He told her that Ryan had called the Human Resources office that morning, that the call was on record, and that anyone who claimed Ryan had simply failed to appear was either lying or repeating a lie. He told her these things plainly, the way a man speaks when he has decided he no longer has anything to lose by speaking. Eleanor felt the floor shift beneath her. She had been told there was no call. She had let Gavin frame the absence as abandonment, and she had signed her name to it in front of the entire board. The certainty she had been carrying for a week began to curdle into a different and more frightening feeling, which was the suspicion that she had been handled, and that the man who had handled her was still smiling at her across the conference table every morning. Walter was not finished. He told her something else, something the official history of Whitmore Logistics had quietly forgotten. Years earlier, before Eleanor had ever set foot in the building as anything but the founder's daughter, the company had nearly collapsed under a catastrophic shipping crisis, a tangle of failed routes and broken contracts that could have ended everything her father built. The man who had worked 4 straight days without sleep to untangle it, who had personally saved accounts worth millions, was Ryan Carter. And when the danger passed, Ryan had let others take the credit, because he had never cared who got the praise as long as the work was done. That afternoon, Eleanor closed her office door and began doing the thing she should have done before she ever fired anyone. She pulled the personnel files, the shipment logs, the internal reports, and she read them not as a chief executive looking to confirm a decision, but as a person trying to find out what was true. The deeper she went, the colder she became, because the documents did not match the story she had been told, and the gaps between them all pointed in one direction. The report that had condemned Ryan had been edited. The version in the system listed him as absent without notice, but the metadata showed it had been altered the same afternoon as the board meeting after the firing, by an account that traced back to Gavin Pierce. The discrepancy in the shipment that Gavin had flagged so regretfully was real, but the record showed the shipment had been rerouted on Gavin's own authorization, not lost through any failure of Ryan's. Gavin had created the problem, blamed it on the one man who might have caught him, and used a sick mother's hospital visit as the cover that made it all look natural. She kept pulling threads, and the pattern widened past a single firing. Operating contracts that should have stayed with established carriers had been quietly shifted over the past several months to a vendor called Meridian Freight Partners. The transfers were small, staggered, buried in the kind of routine paperwork no one questioned. When she traced the ownership of Meridian Freight Partners through 2 layers of holding companies, she found Gavin Pierce's name on a list of shareholders. He was not just protecting his position, He was draining the company through the same door he had used to push Ryan out. Eleanor understood then that she had not made a hasty mistake, so much as she had been steered into one. Gavin had needed Ryan gone before Ryan noticed the contracts moving, and she had been the instrument he used to do it. The realization should have made her feel like a victim, but it did not, because she knew that no one had forced her hand in that conference room. She had wanted to look strong, and Gavin had simply handed her the chance. She could have moved against Gavin immediately, but she was not naive enough to think she would win. He had spent years cultivating the senior leaders and at least 2 members of the boardmen who had known her only as Charles Whitmore's untested daughter. If she accused him without an airtight case and lost, she would not just fail to remove him, she would hand him the proof that she was reckless and unfit, and the board might use it to take the company from her entirely. She needed evidence no one could explain away, and she needed it before Gavin realized she was looking. There was one more thing she needed to do, and it had nothing to do with the company. She drove to the hospital where Ryan's mother had been admitted, telling herself it was due diligence, knowing it was something else. She found the old woman in a quiet room on a recovery floor, frail and clear-eyed, and she introduced herself only as someone who worked with Ryan, because she did not have the courage to say what she had actually done to him. The woman spoke about her son the way mothers do when they are proud and worried in equal measure. She told Eleanor that Ryan had been carrying everything alone since his wife died, that he worked all day and came home to count pills and sit by her bed at night, that he had sold things she did not know about to keep the nurse coming and never once let her see him struggle. She said it without complaint, simply as the truth of her son's life, and every word of it landed in Eleanor like a stone. Eleanor drove home that night with her hands tight on the wheel, and the full shape of what she had done finally clear to her. The man she had called unreliable in front of the board had been the most quietly reliable person in her entire company, carrying a weight that would have broken most people, and asking nothing from anyone. She had taken his livelihood at the exact moment he needed it most, and she had done it to look impressive for a room full of investors. The strength she had been so proud of looked in that light like nothing more than cruelty with good posture. She decided that fixing the company was not enough. She had to make it right with Ryan, and she suspected that would be far harder, because a man who asks for nothing is also a man who has learned to expect nothing. The next morning she found his address in the old files and drove out to the small house on the edge of the city, and she stood on his porch in the cold with no speech prepared and no authority to hide behind. Ryan opened the door and looked at her without surprise, as if he had half expected that the world would eventually send her back to him. He did not invite her in right away. He simply stood in the doorway, a dish towel over one shoulder, the sounds of the house behind him, and waited to hear what the woman who had fired him could possibly have to say on his own porch. Eleanor told him the truth, all of it, without softening her own part. She told him she had been wrong, that she had let Gavin Pierce frame him, that she had found the altered report and the rerouted shipment and the contracts bleeding out to a company Gavin secretly owned. She told him she had needed him to look replaceable so she could look strong, and that there was no version of the story in which she came out of it as anything but the person who had hurt him. She did not ask for forgiveness because she had not earned the right to ask for anything. Ryan listened to all of it, his expression unchanged. When she finished, he told her something she had not expected. He said he had known about the contracts. He had noticed the Meridian transfers months earlier, had started keeping his own copies of the reports because something about them felt wrong, and had intended to bring it to her before he understood that Gavin had already decided to remove him first. He had walked out of that conference room carrying not just a cardboard box, but a private archive of everything Gavin had been hiding. For Eleanor, it was as if a door she had not known existed had swung open. The evidence she needed, the proof no one could explain away, had been sitting in this small house the whole time, in the keeping of the man she had thrown out. She felt a flicker of hope, and was immediately ashamed of it, because she realized she was even now thinking of what Ryan could do for her. She made herself stop and ask the only honest question, which was whether he would help, not for the company, not for her, but because Gavin should not be allowed to win. Ryan did not answer the way she hoped. He told her that he had stopped his truck for her in the rain because he did not leave people stranded, not because he had forgiven her, and not because he wanted his old life back. He told her without anger that he no longer believed leadership rewarded the people who did the work, that he had watched it fail too many times, and that he was tired of pouring himself into a building that would discard him the moment it was convenient. He kept the habit of integrity, he said, but he had lost his faith that it mattered. It was the most he had ever said to her, and it stung worse than anger would have. She understood that she was asking him to risk the only peace he had left for the sake of a place that had already proven what it thought of him. She did not argue with him on his own porch. She thanked him for the rain, for the coffee, for telling her the truth, and she drove away knowing that the hardest part was not gathering evidence against Gavin, but earning the trust of a man who had every reason never to trust the company again. In the days that followed, Eleanor worked 2 fights at once. She kept building her case against Gavin in secret, comparing her own findings against the records she now knew existed in Ryan's keeping, careful never to move so openly that Gavin would sense the ground shifting. And she began slowly to change the way she ran the company, not as a performance for the board, but because she had finally seen what her old way of leading had cost. She started asking the dock workers their names. She started reading the reports for what they hid as much as what they showed. Gavin noticed the change before she expected him to. He was too experienced to miss the way she lingered on the operations floor, the way she had stopped deferring to his summaries. The questions she now asked that cut a little too close to the contracts he had been moving. He did not confront her. Instead, he began quietly to do what he did best, which was to prepare the room. He spoke privately with the board members who already doubted her. He framed her new attention to detail as instability, her empathy as weakness, her questions as the flailing of a young executive in over her head. By the time the board convened for the quarterly review, Gavin had laid his ground so carefully that the meeting was less a review than an ambush. He opened with figures that made the company's recent stumbles, the stalled shipments, the soured vendor, the very problems his own scheme had caused, look like the direct result of Eleanor's poor judgment. He spoke of the firing of a respected 12-year manager as evidence of her rashness, recasting his own manipulation as her impulsiveness. He never raised his voice. He simply turned every fact she might have used against him into a fact against her. Eleanor sat at the head of the table and felt the room turning member by member, the same way it had turned the day she fired Ryan, except now she was the one standing alone in the glass. She had her own findings, but laid out in that hostile room, against Gavin's years of cultivated trust, they sounded like the desperate counterattack of a cornered woman. She could see it in their faces. The proof she had gathered was real, and it was not going to be enough, because the people in this room had already decided what kind of person she was. She had told Ryan she would not ask him again, and she meant to keep that even as she watched her position collapse. She would not drag a man who had finally found peace back into a fight that had already cost him everything once. So she made her case alone, knowing it was failing, and prepared herself to lose the company her father had built, not because she lacked the truth, but because she lacked anyone in that room willing to believe it. Then the conference room door opened. Ryan Carter walked in, soaked at the shoulders, from a rain that had started again outside, carrying a worn folder under his arm. He had not been invited, and he had not been expected, and the sight of him stopped Gavin mid-sentence. Eleanor felt her breath catch the same way it had caught on that dark roadside when the light first found his face, because once again, against every reason he had to stay away, the man had shown up. Ryan did not look at the board. He looked at Gavin, and he set the folder on the long glass table without hurry. Inside were the records he had kept for months, the original unedited reports, the rerouting authorizations bearing Gavin's name, The paper trail connecting Meridian Freight Partners back through its holding companies to the man who had spent the morning calling Eleanor unfit. He had walked out of this room a week earlier with these documents in a cardboard box, and now he had brought them back to the only place they could finish what Gavin had started. The room that had been turning against Eleanor stopped and went still. The board members who had nodded along with Gavin leaned forward over the pages, and the figures that had seemed like proof of her incompetence rearranged themselves into proof of his fraud. Gavin tried for a moment to do what he always did, to reframe, to smile, to turn the facts, but there was nothing he could say that the documents did not contradict in his own handwriting. The architecture of trust he had built over years came down in the space of a few minutes. Eleanor should have felt only triumph, and part of her did. But underneath it sat the harder truth that Ryan's arrival had forced into the light. The evidence that saved her had existed for months in the hands of a man she had humiliated, and the only reason it was on this table now was that he had chosen against everything to bring it. The victory was never really hers, and the realization stripped away the last of the pride she had been carrying since she took her father's chair. As the board absorbed what the folder contained, and Gavin sat for the first time without an answer, Eleanor looked across the glass table at Ryan, and the thing she felt was not the relief of a chief executive who had kept her company. It was the plain shame of a person who finally understood what she had done. She had destroyed the dignity of a good man because she had been too quick to judge, and no amount of vindication in that room could undo the fact that he had carried the proof of his own innocence in silence rather than beg a company that had already decided he did not matter. Gavin Pierce was removed from the company within the hour. The board, faced with his own signature on documents it could not explain away, voted to terminate him and refer the matter of Meridian Freight Partners to the company's legal counsel. He gathered nothing into a cardboard box on his way out. He simply stood, straightened his jacket, and left the glass room where he had spent years building an empire of small lies. And the men who had nodded along with him that morning could no longer meet his eyes. Eleanor watched him go and felt none of the satisfaction she had expected. The threat was gone. The company was hers again. And yet the victory sat strangely in her chest because winning had not erased the thing she had done to get here. She had kept her father's company, but she had nearly lost it through the same arrogance that had cost a good man his livelihood, and no vote of the board could give that back to him. The truth she now had to live with was simpler and harder than any fraud Gavin had committed. She had used her power to judge a man without ever once stopping to listen to him. She had done it for an audience to look like the kind of leader she thought the board wanted, and she had been so certain of her own judgment that she never considered she might be wrong. Gavin had handed her the opportunity, but the cruelty had been hers. She understood now that the most dangerous thing she had carried into that chair was the quiet conviction that her certainty was the same as the truth. Ryan, for his part, stood in the quiet after Gavin's exit, with a choice of his own to make. He had brought the folder because the truth deserved to be told, and because Gavin should not be allowed to win, but he had not decided what came after. He could walk back out into the rain, return to the small house, and the careful life he had rebuilt around his mother's illness, and keep the distance he had spent the last weeks defending. No one in that room could make him stay. He had learned the hard way that the company took far more than it ever gave back. What held him there was not the company. It was the woman at the head of the table who had driven to his porch with no authority to hide behind and told him the truth about her own failure without asking him to soften it. He had spent weeks believing that leadership never changed, that the people in the glass rooms were all the same. Eleanor had not behaved like the rest of them, and that small, stubborn fact made it harder to walk away than he wanted to admit. In the days that followed, Eleanor did the thing that frightened her most, which was to make her apology public. She gathered the company, not the board, but the dispatchers and the dock workers and the coordinators who had watched Ryan carry his box to the elevator and she stood in front of them without a folder or a prepared defense. She told them plainly that she had fired a good man for a failure that was never his, that she had been manipulated and had allowed it because it served her pride, and that the fault for all of it was hers alone. She named Ryan in front of them, and she named what she had done to him, and she did not try to make herself look better in the telling. The room that had watched her fire him in cold certainty now watched her account for it in the open, and the difference between those two moments was the whole distance she had traveled. Some of the older workers, who had kept their doubts quiet for weeks, finally let those doubts settle into something like respect, not for the chief executive who never made mistakes, but for the one who could stand up and admit she had. When she finished, she turned to Ryan, who had come at her request, and stood at the back of the room. She offered him his position back, and more than that, she offered it as a debt she knew she could never fully repay. She did not dress it up. She told him the company needed him, that she needed him, and that she would understand completely if he chose to walk out the door and never return. Ryan considered her offer in front of all of them, and when he answered, he did not speak about himself. He told her that he would come back, but only on one condition, and the condition had nothing to do with salary or title. He said that every person in the building had to be treated as a human being, and not as a line on a report, that no one's name should ever be decided behind a closed door while they sat outside it unheard. He had been reduced to a number once, and he would not return to help run a company that reduced anyone else the same way. Eleanor agreed without hesitation, because it was the only thing he had ever asked of the company in 12 years, and because she understood that his condition was also the cure for the very flaw that had nearly destroyed her. She had run the company by its data and its performance and its appearances, and it had blinded her to the people the data was supposed to describe. Ryan was not asking for a favor. He was handing her the principle she should have led by from the beginning. The change did not happen all at once, but it happened. Eleanor began to spend her mornings on the operations floor instead of behind the glass. She learned the names Ryan had always known, the overtime hours, the small troubles that never made it into a report. She stopped measuring her leadership by how strong she appeared to the board and started measuring it by whether the people who did the actual work felt seen. The company steadied under her, not because she had become softer, but because she had finally become honest. Something shifted between her and Ryan as well, slowly, and without either of them naming it. The cold distance of those first days, the chief executive, and the man she had wronged, gave way to something quieter and more equal. They were two people who had each been broken in different ways, she by her own pride, and he by a world that had taught him not to hope. And in working side by side, they found in each other a kind of understanding that neither had expected to find again. It was not loud, and it was not sudden, but it was real. He learned that her hardness had been fear wearing armor, and that underneath it was a person trying desperately not to fail the father she had lost. She learned that his silence had never been weakness, that the man who asked for nothing did so because he had already learned how little the world gave back, and that his kindness was a choice he made every single day in spite of that. The respect between them deepened into something that did not need to be spoken aloud to be felt. His mother recovered enough to come home, though her heart would always be fragile, and Eleanor found herself more than once at the small house on the edge of the city, sitting with the old woman she had first met, under a borrowed name. She no longer pretended she was only a colleague. She had told Ryan's mother the truth of what she had done and what she was trying to undo. And the old woman, with the clear eye of someone who had watched her son carry too much for too long, had decided to forgive her for the simple reason that her son had. Winter came on, and on one of its last cold evenings, Eleanor stood with Ryan outside the hospital after the two of them had spent several hours there with his mother through a difficult afternoon. The old woman was stable again, resting inside, and the danger had passed for now. The two of them stepped out through the glass doors into the dark, tired in the way that people are tired only after they have been afraid together, and found that the sky had opened and the rain had begun to fall. It was the same kind of rain that had fallen the night her car died on the outer highway, steady cold drumming against the pavement, and neither of them missed the echo of it. Ryan reached into his coat and drew out the same worn umbrella he had carried toward her window that night, the one he had angled to keep her dry while he checked an engine that would not start. He opened it now over the two of them, and they stood together beneath it at the edge of the hospital light. Neither of them spoke about the past. There was no need to recount the conference room, or the box, or the dark roadside, or the long weeks it had taken to come from there to here. All of it was understood between them, the way things are understood by two people who have stopped performing for anyone, and they simply stood beneath the old umbrella and watched the rain come down. Eleanor thought standing there about everything she had once believed would keep her safe. She had believed in power, in being decisive, in never showing weakness, in the authority of the chair her father had left her. None of it had saved her on that highway. None of it had brought the truth to light in that glass room. The thing that had actually rescued her both times was the kindness of a man who had every reason in the world to turn his back, and had chosen again and again not to. That was the lesson she would carry for the rest of her life, the one no business school and no board had ever taught her. What saves a person in the end is rarely their power, or their money, or their position. It is the decency of someone who could have walked away and stayed instead. Ryan had been wronged by her, dismissed by her, judged in his absence, by people who never asked his side. And when she was the one stranded in the dark, he had turned his car around. The rain fell, and the old umbrella held, and the two of them stood beneath it without needing to say any of it out loud. They had both come a long way from the people they were the night the engine first died on that highway. She had learned to listen, and he had learned to hope. And in the narrow shelter of a single umbrella on a cold winter night, neither of them was alone in the rain anymore. Never judge a person by a single moment of failure or by a cold line on a report. Behind every time someone arrives late, falls silent, or looks exhausted, there may be a battle they are quietly fighting on their own. Ryan Carter was carrying a dying mother and a grief no one could see, and the company repaid him by reducing him to a story told in a room he wasn't allowed to enter. Kindness and the willingness to listen will always be worth more than power built on fear. The strongest thing Eleanor Whitmore ever did was not firing a man in front of the board. It was admitting she was wrong and learning to listen at last.